Okay, welcome to today's live call, beaming straight from Crete, the ancient origins of so much of Greek culture. Now, I've opened today up and asked for questions of what to be discussed, and I had two suggestions. One from Matteo, which was to keep diving into the mythic, because I've been sharing some of the lore of the old gods and the deep archetypal wisdom that is held inside these myths. And another from Charlie, which beautifully complements it and grounds it at the other end of the spectrum, was asking how the different environment here in Crete and the Mediterranean in general affects the herbs that we could be growing in other countries. So, you could take the same thyme, the same species of thyme, and grow it in the northern rivers where I've been based. And you could grow it here in Crete, and you'd have two different medicines. And so, how do these, what's the effect of these? So then I took these two questions and I took it as a Mr. Squiggle drawing where, you've got these different lines and you have to put it together into one picture, which was a little challenging. But I think I've landed with a structure that can help us to explore how these things connect. And since I'm here in Greece, I want to ground it in the Hippocratic tradition. Um, so I'm going to open the discussion by starting, and Hippocratic medicine is steeped in, immersed in, informed in, and grows out of the Greek mysteries and the Greek mythologies, right? So, one of the core texts of the Hippocratic corpus is called On Airs, Waters, and Places. And it starts with this very simple proposition. And it's that if you want to understand a person, you have to understand the people. And if you want to understand that person's people, you first have to understand the winds that they breathe, the waters that they drink, the landscape that they inhabit, the season that they find themselves in that presses in against skin and bone, the way in which climate becomes constitution, right? And that geography and the gods of that geography are internalized into biology, right? The way that there's this constant flux and flow that merges and moves between us and what we're immersed in, right? And so this is um, this is the common or perhaps universal sentiment to the big traditions that I've studied, the tradition of Chinese medicine, the tradition of Ayurvedic medicine, the tradition of Tibetan and Mongolian medicine, and it's certainly core to Hippocratic medicine. And so the Hippocratic doctor was therefore um, instructed not just to study the symptoms of disease, right? And not even just to study the systems of physiology and the body, but to study the world around, to study not just the text of that body, but the context of that body, to look at the direction of the winds, to note the mineral character of the waters that they're consuming, the north or east facing direction of the town, the seasonal fluctuations of that particular year, the local diets that those people are immersed in, that determines the constitution of the individual and the constitution of the community as a whole, right? And so whew, already we've got this notion that illness is not just located inside a symptom or a system or an organ or a tissue, but that this ease emerges from relationship, right? From relationship between body and biosphere and psyche and season, between the cells and the stars, between the herb and the horoscope under which it is picked, right? And if we take this as our foundation, I'm going to take this as the foundation for today to uh, be able to address the questions that have been raised, right? And so inside this starting point, we understand that the practice of medicine, right, the practice of herbal medicine or the practice of any medicine is not the merely the administration of a substance, right, the dispensation of a tincture, right, but the art of perceiving context, to read the book of nature, as Paracelsus says, to perceive the living fields ever larger that encompass and contextualize whatever that particular person, illness, organ, or symptom is, right? And yet, our herbal textbooks, right, pretty much all of them, train the brain into a blindness to nature's pattern, right? They they do incredible harm when you immerse yourself in this language that materia medicas and herbal books are written inside, right? And so we all know the modern myth of the invisible ship, of Captain Cook arriving at a South Pacific island, I think is the general telling of it, and the native people there not seeing the ship because they'd never seen a ship, so they were blind to the ship, right? Now that's untrue. It's untrue. It's popularized in The Secret or What the Bleep or one of these movies. Um, in fact, it was a botanist, Joseph Banks, and he just wrote that when they arrived, Captain Cook arrived in Australia, that the indigenous people seemed to pay them very little mind as they first pulled up. That's all. But then later on, they like threw stones and spears at them when they tried to come ashore. Right? They very much saw the ship, right? It's indigenous people the world over are incredible observers of the world around them. The blindness there is not the blindness of the old cultures. The and yet there is a blindness, and that story is a beautiful parable, and it contains great truth, despite being based upon an exaggeration, a fabrication, and a complete lie. Um, and it is the way in which we Europeans have blinded ourselves, right? We've blinded ourselves to the book of nature. We've blinded ourselves so that we can see trees but not forests. And so, as I build towards answering and addressing these two questions, I want to take you through some modern examples that help expand upon that foundational insight of the Hippocratic text on breaths, places. So, um, one of them is that as well as it all builds upon this notion of not being able to see the forest for the trees, right? And so one of these is the way in which our biologists have been, the blind ones that couldn't see the invisible ship. And what Virchow saw was as the foundation of biology is this individual cell, right? Cellular biology is still the foundation of how we practice biology at present. Um, and he saw that because, and he wrote very explicitly about it because of the philosophy that he was inside of individualism and the what was in the air at the time. You can look into it; it's incredible, right? Um, and what we've come to see instead is that the cell is the tree, and it is a part of a forest called the extracellular matrix, right? And so the this the cell is like an apple on an apple tree, and the apple tree is the extracellular matrix. It's the environment around the cell which determines the cell, right? And we didn't see that. We didn't see the extracellular matrix because we weren't looking for it. We weren't looking for relationship. We were looking for individuals, right? Because of the individualistic culture that was emerging in that particular time, right? And he was had an axe to grind about democracy and all of these sorts of things. And makes sense. But these examples are throughout all of medicine and Western science. Another thing that we didn't see is throughout all of our anatomy, we have seen parts but not wholes. And so there's this entire system. We thought there was nothing new in anatomy for us to discover. We've thought that, and still people think that to this day. And yet it turns out that one of the most important systems in anatomy and physiology is the system of connective tissue, the fascial web that holds and binds everything together, that which connects every cell with every other cell, with every tissue, with every other tissue, with every bone, with every ligament, with holds all the organs together. This connective tissue that is not just a glue, but is the ancestor of the nervous system. Before living systems had brains and nervous systems, they had fascia, and fascia is a channel for this felt sense of interoception. It is an ancestor to the nervous system, and yet we didn't see it. We cut it away. It's the white stuff around muscles. It's all the stuff that we cut away. It's the forest that we cut away to see the tree. And so we didn't see the connections. We didn't see the connective tissue, right? And this is what the Chinese saw in their meridians. And there is a hard, solid, very real uh, connection between connective tissue and meridians, and it seems that through a very different way of seeing, through felt embodied fascial stretches and movement, and the deep modes of seeing that Taoist culture, instantiated in those people, they were able to see fascial lines to feel and experience and map them with incredible accuracy that we have now dissected and shown and proven. You can cut out the bladder meridian and put it on an anatomy table, and it has been done. All of the meridians have been cut out and shown. They are hard anatomical structures that convey consciousness and energy and piezoelectric charge, but we didn't see them. They were an invisible ship to us. They were the connections. They are the forest, not the trees, right? And so too with genes, right? We found the book of life, we thought, and we were like, oh, this is the book of life. This is what contains all the information. This is what determines who you are in all of these ways, right? And we came up with this kind of genetic determinism. And then the Human Genome Project just sort of like actually belly flopped that entire idea, because there's 26,000 genes in a human being, and there's 100,000 proteins, so it makes no sense at all. And there's some organisms that have much more less seeming complexity socially and in terms of their sentience, and more genetic complexity. And so what we've come to understand is epigenetics, which is the way the environment is speaking to genes, and the way in which there's this plastic flow, right? That that the book of life is the text, and the environment is the larger context, right? So inside that, they say genes may load the gun, but it's the environment that pulls the trigger, right? So we're still caught in this outdated model of genetics, which has not really taken on the plasticity and flow of how the environment affects it, right? It's just like the connective tissue, and also just like the extracellular matrix. So stay with me. We're going on a journey. Stay with me. We're coming to herbs. We're coming to myths, right? And so this sense of the way in which uh, um, individual organisms, which we see as individual organisms and have seen as individual organisms and different species. We've seen forests rather than trees. We're moving towards systems biology, which starts to see Gaian patterns and loops, starts to see species as wholes, starts to see the boundaries between species being broken down, starts to see this fluid movement of genes horizontally across species. And we see the way in which it is not just like random chance that drives evolution, which is what we've proposed so far, right? From a God in the gaps to chance in the gaps explanation, we've been blind to the intelligence, the active intelligence and striving and dialogue between life and its environment, the way in which it's deserts that write krill-necked lizards and oceans that have composed whales and then sing through them, right? We've been blind to these relationships, these systems, right? We've seen single symptoms of species rather than seeing them in their larger Gaian context, in the same way that we didn't see the connective tissue in our own bodies, right? It's not the text of your genes that determine anything at all, but the context of you inside your larger environment, right? So this book of life is in our genes is a language, yes, but like all language, it is cannot be read myopically with your nose against the billboard, right? Think about this is how human language works as well, right? The individual word means nothing at all if the same word in different context means completely different things. Now, if I was inside a crowded movie theater and yelled fire, it would mean one thing. And if I was a military leader in a war and yelled fire, it means a different thing. If my lover traced her tongue up my spine and I whispered fire, it would mean a different thing, right? Each one of these, and if I was a witch under the moonlight, you know, inside a ritual space and I invoked the word fire, it would mean another thing, right? Fire is just the tree, not the forest. And so for us to read any single word, it's only the illiterate that try to sound out a word by the letters that it is composed of, right? We perceive letters as wholes. When you are literate in something, you perceive wholes. And so you will have seen those exercises where a sentence is like 90% of it is crossed out and just the little tops of it remain and still you can read it. Or they jumble all the letters around except the first and the last and you can still read it and make sense of it. It's we don't look at the trees of a sentence. We look at the forest as a whole, right? And this kind of literacy, this kind of ecological literacy, this kind of archetypal literacy is the literacy that is required for us to be able to practice medicine, right? Is things don't make sense outside of their context. They exist inside something larger. Like $100 bill has no meaning by itself. It's only inside the economy, the investment portfolios, the general population sense of optimism or fear, that means whether or not you can go and buy several bags of shopping or whether someone will trade it for you for a carrot, like it's the context of everything, right? Everything is a tree inside a forest. And this doesn't just apply to medicine, but it applies to psychology. This systems biology that we're starting to explore now is happening also in family systems, right? The psychology of family systems, right? And transgenerational trauma. It says trying to put an individual in a slum in Mumbai on the couch to be Freudianly analyzed for their, trauma and depression It makes no sense when that person doesn't have shelter and food and has all the structural inequality and violence that is around them. You have to understand the larger picture, right? You have to understand and read the context to understand why that individual serotonin is low, right? And is this is the core understanding, I believe, that's folded inside that Hippocratic text. But we keep finding it again and again and again. It comes through to us in the germ theory of disease, right? And everybody has, understood, heard the story uh, of Pasteur recounting on his deathbed. It's not the germ is nothing, the terrain is everything, because he'd had this long-standing argument with Béchamp and Bernard and these other people that were giving a larger contextual analysis of what's going on. But we also see this in our understanding of viruses, where we had thought, are they even alive? A virus just seems like a stupid little piece of code all by itself. It doesn't even get to be called a thing or a living system. And that is because we were looking at them all wrong. We were looking at a virus as a forest rather than seeing as a tree rather than seeing it as a forest. It's like trying to understand the intelligence of an ant nest by looking at one single ant, right? We understand now that viruses are meta-intelligences, that they are viral swarms, that they are a large organism that inhabits an enormous ecoscape, right? Just not just a forest, but the waters and various different species inside it. And so we've seen a virus as an individual enemy projectile. It's what we've seen it as, right? Rather than as this swarm that is a reflection of a whole ecoscape as it shifts towards equilibrium and out of it, right? We've completely misunderstood these nature spirit like meta intelligences that are the living animate forces inside forests, right? Inside forests and all the organisms that inhabit forests, right? But it's not just biology that works in this way. It goes all the way down. It goes all the way down to quantum physics, right? Where we understand that there's no individual particle that has fixed properties by itself, but that they're all entangled, and there's this relational flux and flow between measurement and observation, right? And we start to see space no longer as something that is just empty, like junk DNA, but as a field, an intelligent field of dynamic forces and relations, right? And so this is where we come to. We come to having to see fields and forces and relationships, right? So when we're looking at an individual patient, we're not looking at them like that individual virus, right? Not as a sealed entity all by itself, and certainly not it's their symptom, right? Oh, I have this symptom here and this symptom there, and they are different. And I will see the elbow specialist for the spot on my elbow and the wrist specialist for the spot on my wrist, right? There are all these different symptoms. No, instead, what we're seeing is individuals and individual symptoms are like vortices, are like whirlpools, right? That are composed of the flux and flow of relationship with the larger environment. So from that mind bending introduction, then we come to Charlie's question, right? Which is what happens to the plant? What's the difference between and let's make it really clear. If I took a cutting of rosemary from my plant in the Northern Rivers in its subtropical, moist, rainforest laden environment, and I took that cutting and I jumped on the plane, I came to Crete, and I grew it here, right? And then once it had matured, I made an essential oil from the original plant, right? The same plant, And the one that I'd grown here, lo and behold, the chemistry is nothing alike, right? It's vastly, vastly different. And yet it was the same plant, right? It's the environment, stupid, as that quote goes, right? It's the context, it's the airs, the breaths, the waters, the places, right? So because you're passionate, I assume, about plants and medicines, let me dig in here finally and ground this into the materia medica and our understanding of these medicines. So, what we have is we can see the way in which the environment shapes and morphs plants in very different ways, right? Inside a very yin, cold, white, polar environment, the plant, right? In the same way that there is the a goddess and a god, right? Ultimately, at this highest level, there's all these different faces of it. There is a plant, according to Goethe, right? And you know, plant of life, when it grows at the pole and it's cold, right? It contracts and its leaves become like pine needles, right? Right? Underneath that particular environment, this is what happens. It comes like this, right? That forces, those contractive, cold forces drive it like that, yes? Whereas plants at the equator, right, underneath that hot, steamy, expansive equatorial region, then they cause these enormous leaves, these vast, huge leaves that open and open and open and open. And so too, we see our own psyche in those environments, right? Interiorize in the deep winter of the polar north, goes in, just like the plant's vitality goes down, down, down into the root and it forges strength in the root, right? All of our best adaptogens come from high altitude, mountain, colder environments where that force forces its vital force down into its depths. Right. And the intensity of that environment, like Siberian ginseng or rhodiola, which I gathered in Siberia as well, right? It's that hard environment, or maca from the New World up in the Andes. It's that hard environment that forces resilience and it sends it down into the taproot, right? Whereas then there's something else that happens, right? That brings that force up, that formative force of the environment that expands it up where all the energy is in the leaf more strongly, right? And there's an openness and there's a direction of the chi, right? The environment is forging and forming the plant, right? So its chemistry is a reflection of its challenge, right? The challenge of its environment. And when we grow plants without challenge in just a hydroponic, perfectly watered, perfectly nutrified, perfectly lit, like the right hours, Emmys, then you don't grow sweet tomatoes, right? It's got no juice, right? Got no tang. And we don't grow healthy food either, right? So we see this in all of our plants. We see that bitters get stronger where grazing pastures exist. We see that aromatic plants intensify under heat and drought, right? We see that resinous medicines emerge where trees' wounds are more vulnerable to infection, right? We see all of these medicines as a pharmacopoeia of the forest that is collaboratively co-authored between the plant and its environment, between the forest and its trees, right? So this is where we come to this question of the doctrine of signatures. And the doctrine of signatures contains great truth, but it contains great truth in the same way that the myth of the invisible ship contains great truth. The way it's often taught is literal and superstitious, right? It falls too short, and that means people end up with this sort of thinking of just like, oh, well, that means if someone's got edema or dropsy edema of their ankles, then we'll chop off an elephant's foot and give that to them because it looks like it, right? And so it can land in a very, we have to be careful around it. But the larger piece of this is teaching us this mode of thinking, which is analogical thinking rather than analytical thinking, a relational imagination that teaches us to see the connection between things, right? And so, in this regard, this capacity to unblind ourselves as physicians and herbalists, we're not looking at the zoomed in microscope of a chemist, right? This is where we've got our nose against the billboard and we can't read the writing on the wall. But to become an ecological interpreter of the environment of that person, the total environment of how inflammation moves through their brain and skin and gut and character, right? And this is why the over-the-counter one-size-fits-all prescription model of a range of health food stores and apothecaries and private practice fails. Not because the plants have failed, but because the physician has failed, because they are looking at the tree and not the forest. They are the one that cannot perceive the invisible ship in that regard, right? So we really need to be able to move from the text of the path report and the symptom, reading that symptom as like a letter that we're trying to, like the illiterate person trying to read. If knife, right? Don't read knife by sounding it out. You recognize the shape of the word knife and you get it in one go. That's how, once you're literate, that's how you do it. It's the context. In entheogenic practice, this context shows that chemistry is always second. The same chemistry of psilocybin can produce one experience in a jail, right? If someone's, having a bad trip and put in jail, and a different experience in a palliative care environment with soft cushions and gentle light. And this is spoken of as the importance of set and setting, right? Set and setting. That's the environment. That's the forest. That's the context, right? The context of the chemistry is what determines the consciousness that unfolds inside it, right? So we need to see that medicine, that psilocybin, as a seed that, like the cutting that I said, growing from Australia and in Crete, will reflect its set and setting. My prescription will be enormously informed as to how it unfolds according to the therapeutic process of the empathy with which I connected with that person and the intention with which unfolded the set and setting of that prescription, right? And yet, herbal students are taught to look in this fragmented way, right, of receptors and alkaloids and inflammasomes and hormones. These are the letters of words that leave you illiterate in the book of language. And it's very, very disorientating. It's incredibly disorientating, and it leaves you ill-equipped to be able to deal with nature, with disease, with human beings, with this larger forest of meaning that we find ourselves inside. It's it's disorientating the same way that, you know, birds don't just see with their eyes, but they're looking at magnetic fields and, solar flares will disorient them. The sense of direction emerges from an immersion in a larger context, right? We're tracking and feeling and looking and absorbing many different things, not zoomed in under a microscope, but zoomed out, right? Zoomed out to read the larger book of life, the larger context, right? So this means that the journey of medicine of walking the medicine path is really one of restoring right relationship. All my relations, right? All my relations, the relationship between the gut and the brain, the relationship between the lungs and the spleen. In old traditional systems like Chinese medicine, then you know all the organs are seen as like a family where the the liver is like the husband and or the wife, and the gallbladder is like the husband, and where its child is is the heart, and its grandchild is the spleen, right? There's this series of relationships that are around like this. Or instead, the heart is like the emperor, and the lungs are like the prime minister, and the liver is like the general in charge of the army. Relationship, 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 right? Between uh, cells and organs and systems and larger systems, between the cell and the community, between the economy and the ecology, between consciousness and the cosmos, is relationships. Is we've we see stars at present, but we don't see the constellations that they form, right? Which is not looking at the spot itself, not looking at the symptom itself, but looking at the spaces between it, seeing the lines that join it, so that then you don't just have a series of random symptoms, but suddenly you see the Big Dipper, right? Suddenly you see Orion's belt. Suddenly you see the lion in the sky that is there from those gleaming little seemingly individual symptoms, right? It's a different way of seeing the spaces, right? Right? Seeing the spaces, never looking at the tumor, but always the terrain, right? Never treating the disease, but always the dynamic, right? Always the person, the whole, the larger pattern. And so, in the same way that a musician studies the silent spaces, a good musician, and an artist studies not objects but light, and a sculptor sees below the stone, then a herbalist, a physician, a healer sees not the thing, but its home, its broader context, its airs, its breaths, its waters, its places, its spaces, right? To study medicine is to study a Gaian grammar, the a relational participation, to remember, to remember what we have, to unlearn what we have learned. Chemistry does not heal alone. The plant does not heal alone. The practitioner does not heal alone. Medicine emerges, healing emerges through relationship, right? Through relationship. Yes, the relationship between the immune axis and the gut, right? And the gut and the brain. Yes, yes. But between all our relationships, right? All our relations. And this is this foundational Hippocratic insight, right? That helps us see things in these ever widening circles. That the wound cannot be separate from the hand that carries it, and the hand cannot be separate from the labor that shaped it, and the labor cannot be separate from the society that demands it, and the society is not separate from the land that nourished it, and the land is not separate from the climate and the sun and the stars under which it bathed, right? That everything is nested inside a series of relationships. Everything is nested inside this various different climates of consciousness, these atmospheres of unfolding and becoming. And so this is where I finally circle back to Matteo, who was speaking of asking about more of the mythic, right? So inside of this, why, as somebody whose, you know, job description seemingly is to help people heal, you know, hemorrhoids and get less flatulence and get rid of their disease symptoms. Why would I be traveling around Greece studying myths and not with a Lonely Planet guide, but with, a book of Dionysus as my guide? Why am I immersing myself in the study of ancient gods and imaginary monsters and forgotten heroes, right? Why? Because I'll tell you why, is that it is inside this law that this ancient grammar is contained, that this is the way in which we regain this literacy, right? It's folded into these stories is this mode of consciousness. It's the medicine that we need. It's it's not that traditional medicine like Chinese medicine is valuable because it preserves uh, better ways to treat the common cold. That's the least of its value in this moment of absolute crisis on our culture and our planet. It's that traditional systems of medicine preserve different ways of seeing and being, and the medicine that we each need as individual, and that our species needs as a whole, is to remember this different modes of seeing. And these are folded into the myths. You can't study Chinese medicine without studying Taoist philosophy of yin yang and the flow of the Tao. You can't study Ayurvedic medicine without the larger context of Vedic thought. You can't study Hippocratic medicine without understanding Apollo and Zeus and Dionysus, right? You have to understand medicine inside its context too. And through studying the myths, through these stories, this is the medicine. This is, like I told you at the start, like taking psilocybin. These stories are these labyrinthine different structures that enter into consciousness and rewire you. If you would like to be able to see the invisible ship that you cannot see at present, listen to me when I tell you this, sweet friends. This is how you get there. It's not just about, okay, tell me the three different ways to treat the four different forms of diarrhea and what are the herbs that go with them, Jimmy. No, 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 no. You will never get there like that. It's like trying to sound out a word by its letters that comprise it. You must change the way you see. And you change the way you see by ingesting these ancient modes of seeing. It's not through information, but initiation. And that initiation happens through law, right? And that law is here in these images and stories. It's here in the old cultures. And for us, those of us that are of European bloodlines, then the musical scales that resound with us are the musical scales of our ancestors, not Chinese classical operatic music. It doesn't quite land. And the archetypal law, as much as I have learnt from China and Tibet and India, it's the story of our own gods and goddesses, the story of our own heroes and heroines, right? Of our own monsters and medicines that goes in, that fits us like a receptor, right? That helps remind us of this universal and archetypal truths. And that's the medicine that you're looking for. It's the medicine that you're yearning for. It's what led you to study this kind of medicine, not cardiology or brain surgery. And yet, and yet, you got phytochemistry, right? You went in search of magic and you thought that instead, it's so disappointing and it's so ineffective. It's so ineffective. It's so ineffective. And so the beauty of this is what I'm saying is that in order to be effective, to be a good physician, a good practitioner, and to help people with their symptoms, you need, yes, to learn the things, the practical things inside medicine, but you also need to steep yourself inside a different way of seeing, to antidote the meta illness like a unhealthy, angry, viral swarm of consciousness that has infected our entire culture. That's the madness and the illness that we're all suffering from. And it's antidoted through ancient cultures and ancient law. And that gives you permission. It gives you permission to soak inside medicine, the medicine of myth and magic, right? So, whilst studying herbs, herbs were never prescribed alone. Study the law that they were prescribed alongside, the incantations, the chanting and the ranting of the witches and the wizards, the prescriptions of story and myth of how, Apollo turned Daphne into the laurel leaves. There inside it, folded in, not literally, but metaphorically, is the medicine that will enable you to practice at depth the medicine that you're looking for. And so I think that leaves us with a little bit of time to perhaps pause on this mythic ranting, chanting transmission that I have here from Greece, and to to go to reflections and questions, comments, pushback, and clarifications that anyone may have. Matteo, I'm going to pick on you to start and open. We finished with a mythic, which is your your request.
I love that we went in search for magic and got given phytochemistry.
Yes.
Yeah, that really, really resonated. I've been steeping myself in some traditional wisdom at the moment, and I feel that's gonna deepen. But it was really nice to hear you talk about, yeah, I guess just this European lineage. There's so much time and energy spent talking about traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic, and yeah, I'm just really excited to learn more about this, European mythology that I really haven't heard much about.
Yes, yes. And it's very healing as a Westerner because we've outsourced all sanctity to either the East or to tribal peoples. And then we're
Mm,
consuming it like we consume everything else, as though we can just
mm,
graft on, you know, like the Andean culture inside our soul, And yes, we can learn from all of those cultures, but Jung was very clear on this, and in the same way that as an individual goes on their healing, they have to face their own past, their own childhood, their own family, their own traumas. As a culture, we need to turn around and reclaim the story. And we've been told a story that the West is logical and empty and terrible, and Greece is the home of logic. And as I posted on these other things, it's wrong. It's wrong. It's the home of myth and magic and shamans and incantations and witches. It's a complete rubbish story that's been a lie that was spread by the Enlightenment, right? Just by this one little chapter of history, and we're still stuck on it. Whereas the Renaissance didn't see the Greeks as the home of logic, right? And the Greeks didn't see that either, right? If you read the text and you look at the things, it is roaring with spiritual wisdom. Heraclitus is a Taoist, right? Parmenides is a Vedic seer. They're speaking about consciousness. It's a vast, huge, incredible repository of wisdom. And so is inside Nordic mythology and Celtic mythology, inside your own roots, right? Wherever you are from. And I'm not here saying that the West has any more wisdom than anyone else, but I'm saying that if we only outsource that and we try and consume it from other cultures, we won't heal the deep wound inside us. We have to turn around and face what we've lost. And it's here inside our own roots, right? Making peace with that and reclaiming that I think a sane Western culture can emerge, a second Renaissance. And Renaissance is rebirth, and the rebirth is of the classics, of the old gods, the old myths, and the old ways. That's what happened when those things re-emerged in Italy, was the Renaissance, right? A marriage of reason and reverence, right? These things came together. It wasn't logic went through the roof in the Renaissance. It was the sciences and humanities together, right? Our golden age. And that's what 5th century Greece was, a golden age of mythos and logos together. And that's what I'm trying to teach here. On the one hand, speaking and honoring the language of, histamine and cortisol. On the other hand, collapsing it into the larger context that helps us to be able to utilize that. Right? And I believe if you're here, this is what you came in search of, right? And I just want to be very clear that this is not at the expense of medical efficacy. It is in service of medical efficacy too. I get very real, very reliable, and very deep, unbelievable medical results, confirmed on path tests and with medical imagery and all the rest. And I'm telling you, this is the secret. Change the way you see, right? You have to change the way you see. You have to learn to see the forest, not just the tree. And these myths, they're the medicine. They'll rewire you like an entheogen so that you can see the way I see now. It's through this, right, that has enabled me to be able to become so good at what I do medically. It's through the magic and the myth. Who would have guessed? Who would have guessed? It sounds absurd. And it's true, right? It's enabled me to become literate in systems, to see what others don't see through studying things like Dionysus and Zeus and the witches and the wizards and all of this business. Okay. Questions, comments, thoughts, anyone else who's got something that they would like to bubble with, if there's more here. Charlie didn't join us today, so she's going to have to comment. Has anyone else got something they'd like to share before we close down today's session?
Yeah, actually, I have a question, Jim, regarding the sentience of plants, and the new understanding that every now and again you find out, and it's obviously a breakthrough in just accepting that plants have consciousness in whatever version or iteration we might like to look at it. But the most recent thing I've heard, because I have a fascination with this subject, is that when you water your plants, and you do it on you have a habit of doing that, your plants actually know when you're there that you're watering your plants. And I understand when you pick a plant, whatever energy you've got, if you're just rushing to get some herbs for a salad or whatever, I understand that has an effect on the sentience of the plant, and it's taken me a long time to sort of get to the point where I can relate to my garden, in a sense that, have a respect where, that you just don't just barge in there, because you get the peace from actually communing with it, obviously. But anyway, you're coming back to this situation we have in the world. To me, and when you talk about the mythological background and the roots of all understanding of herbal medicine, no doubt, across basically all the cultures I've ever, come across, in tiny amount of research I've done. My background is shiatsu and remedial massage and that sort of thing. But anyway, I'm just wondering, with this kind of separation, we as species sort of don't really commune with nature. We see ourselves as the dominant species that comes from Western civilization, as an end point, and that somehow we would even have more compassion for ourselves. That's how I looked at it personally, from understanding that, water that. It's like water the seeds of joy. If I'm understanding to water the plants, and commune with the plants, and have them enjoy that, I have to look at myself. Am I watering my seeds of joy, for example. Like, how can that translate to me? Yeah, so just wondering
Okay.
what your thoughts are on all that kind of
Um, yes, I
area.
think where what arises for me is not the astonishment that plants are conscious, but the astonishment at all of our astonishment. That's what's truly astonishing, is that we're just like, what? Plants are sentient? When every single culture for 99.9% of human history, I mean that in a very real and mathematical sense, has been an animate culture that perceived all of life as ensouled and sentient, right? This sense that things are inanimate is this very small aberration, a cult of modernity that's been around flash in the pan. And when we read Descartes saying when he would nail a dog to a board and vivisect it and cut it open, that the wails and screams of pain should be heard just as like the grinding of cogs and wheels that are screaming against each other because that dog has no soul, then we're astonished because we no longer believe that, right? But in to most of our ancestors, our astonishment at the sentience of plants is just as astonishing, just as horrifying in some sense. And we still have this legacy of the dualism, this Cartesian dualism that no other culture had. That there's a separation, like you said, this word separation between matter and mind. And my foundation at the ANU was in philosophy, Eastern religion and Western philosophy. So I'm coming at this from a philosophical framework here. Is that dualism is defunct? It makes no sense. It's philosophically just like you have to abandon it. There's just it's not a stance that we can take, and yet it's the stance that we still all live by, right? And so this is why, cycling back to what I said, is that when we ingest the myths, what we're ingesting is something that is from a culture that was an animist culture. And anima means soul. And so Greek culture saw everything as gods, like Hindu culture. Like everything was sentient, everything roared with soul, not just animals, not just plants, right? Winds, oceans, forests, trees, love, lust, time, power. All of these things were gods. All of these things were animate forces in the world, right? All of them. And so for us, we're still just at the start of this, of just like, yeah, okay, we've got that animals have consciousness, and now we're starting to get that plants maybe do. And it's like, wow, there's like 19 steps after that of what is a being, right? Of what is a daemon, what is a god, what is a deity, right? That sentience, that the entire world is animate. And when we ingest these old stories, we are ingesting an old culture, like an old probiome, right? Like a probiotic from the Paleolithic that goes in and changes us culturally through listening to its stories. And this is the medicine that we require most. It's the medicine that our collective culture requires most. And it's the medicine that anyone wanting to practice medicine requires most. This culture of consciousness from the deep, deep past, an antidote to the insanity of modernity. And now we're out of time, so I'm going to wrap up this transmission here. Thank you all so much for joining me in this live call from Crete.